One of the assumptions I would be very cautious about was that assuming either the European Union or NATO will prevail, I think they're both in trouble, and it would not surprise me if one or other or both of them failed. It might not be immediately, but it could be in the medium term, and I think it's a mistake to be, for example, in an institution which is rabidly anti one of these great powers.
So, Mr. Jermy, thank you so much for joining us and for joining this wonderful forum here in Tbilisi. That's your inputs and your contribution is very important for us to be here. And I'd like to talk about kind of this conflict which has been started in the very beginning of the spring of this year, against Iran. And a lot of scholars say that this kind of actions from the United States against China and its interest in the Middle East, and even more kind of to preventing China's land roads to African continent and etc. How much do you agree with that that idea that this is the kind of the fighting in Iran is a kind of proxy war against China?
Well, first of all, Georgie, thank you for the invitation here. First time in Tbilisi, and it's a fabulous city. I really enjoyed it. I mean, I was in the Navy and I've traveled a lot of capital cities, but Tbilisi is beautiful. I think that is one interpretation, and I think there is a logic to that. And there are those within the American neocon community, if you like, who would agree with that. But I don't think it's the only reason that the war has happened. I think there's clearly a strong Israel issue, and so the greater Israel issue and Israel's view on Iran, although again that seems to be held by a fairly, shall we say, a narrow part of Israeli society, although very much that part of Israeli society which is in politics. And I think the third thing is the tensions and the more complicated situation in the Gulf, because of course what you have in Iran is a Shia state with complex relationships with its Gulf partners. So the partners to the south or to the west of the Gulf are all generally Sunni states, although even that is a oversimplification, because if you take somewhere like Bahrain, about 60% of the Bahraini population are actually Shia. So I think there are a number of complex dynamics going on. And I think it would be a mistake to assume that one of those on its own was responsible.
What do you think about that? With the U.S. campaign, U.S. allies in the European continent, in NATO members, they did refuse to join this kind of actions, this kind of campaign against Iran. Is that the kind of their attitude towards the Trump's administration, or that is the gap, deepening the gap between Europe and the US for a long time now?
I think it's a mixture of at least two things, Georgia. I think the first thing is that there will be some of what you say, which is a strong feeling against the Trump administration. Having said that, that's not the only thing, and I think you will see in a diversity of views in Europe, and they go from those who wish to support, although they have no political traction at the moment, but also from those who are quite anti the campaign. So Spain, for example, has actually stopped. Now what's interesting is my country, in Britain, we find that there is a sort of halfway house where Britain is supporting the Americans in some respects, but only for what they call defensive purposes. I think that's very difficult to sustain that argument. But fundamentally, I think that the issue for the Europeans should be, and is for most of them, is to understand what is in the national interest. And what's in the national interest, surely, is to make sure that the oil supplies from the Gulf keep flowing. So this action, which was taken without any European consultation, is absolutely against the national interest of Europeans. Europeans are critically dependent on Gulf hydrocarbons, as indeed is the Far East. And I think it's a an issue which will soon start to make us think even more as the consequences of that play out. There is an issue as well, and I think one of the reasons that the British have stayed clear is that in international law they see it as an illegal action, and in international law it is an illegal action. So I think that's one of the reasons which is causing the British, for example, to be clear. I think as I look at France, who are seeking a more sort of neutral position, and I suspect the same for the Americans, you're seeing different views. But I'd be surprised if we see any engagement for the Europeans in this actions, because I think it would be a major mistake in terms of their national security.
Okay, great. And what is your assessment? How can United States keep its interest in the Middle Eastern region? I mean, there are a lot of talks that the countries, the Arab countries, are very disappointed of the possibilities of the U.S. to protect them from the Iranian attacks and etc. So is it kind of the end of era of U.S. dominance in the Middle East or not? I
think it's quite possibly the end of the era of U.S. dominance. I think the general assumption from the Gulf states was that, or the Gulf Cooperation Council states, was that having the Americans on your side would mean that you would be protected.
Yes.
We've seen that that's not true. My jobs in the Navy, including being the captain of an air defense destroyer, so I understand how anti-missile systems work. And what we know is that those systems in the West do not work against ballistic missiles, and are not at all against hypersonic missiles. So I think
even sometimes against drones.
Yeah, they're against drones, but it's a very expensive way to shoot down drones. So a drone might be £250,000, a standard missile, $2, $3, $4 million. So I think the issue for the Gulf states is that they are now in a difficult situation because, of course, they rely on the US for a number of things, and they have a close relationship in terms of defense spending and defense equipment and so on. So they will need to take a very delicate middle line somehow, because what will surely be clear to them, I think, that is that it's unlikely that the US will win the war, and that if they're not careful, they will make things worse. But what they've got to work out is how they might best get to a situation of stability and get the Strait of Hormuz opened, so that actually they can get back to being normal economic countries. And I think what's very interesting, despite what may have been the desire, and the person who has written about this is Eldridge Colby, in the strategy of denial, very much a neocon strategy, despite the desire to perhaps impact on China's ability to work internationally. I think they may have done the other thing, because I think what we may find, and certainly I would, in the situation of the Gulf cooperation states, I'd be looking to have a much closer relationship with Russia and with China, because I would calculate that they would be much more likely to be able to make sure that I was secure and that my relationship with Iran was secure.
So in that regard, what have been done to summarize our conversation? Like, on one hand, we are facing the emerging kind of multipolarity. Russia, China, maybe India someday, to emerge as a global power, etc. On the other hand, Trump himself, during his pre-election campaign and even after that, and in the security document published last year, so they declaring that the U.S. is more focusing on the Western Hemisphere. Can we imagine, theoretically, the United States more localized in the Western Hemisphere and the balanced world between other powers? No, I mean, losing this kind of influence in different regions like Europe, Middle East, and etc., and just focusing on the Western Hemisphere?
The short answer to your question is yes. And in fact, not only can we, I think that is what's happening. The published national security strategy was very clear about this, and it came as no surprise to me, because in America's situation, I would want my focus to be first and foremost on America, on my own state and the nearer abroad, so my close neighbors, and secondly on the Far East, because the prospects in economics in the Far East are high. but I also have, in American eyes, a peer competitor, which is China. And how the Americans manage that relationship with China and how China manages that relationship with the United States is critical. I don't think we're going to a multipolar world. I think we have already arrived at a tripolar world. And I would say there are a tripolar world. So I think there are three great powers. I think there are China, Russia, and the United States. The issue is that a lot of the West and other countries such as Israel and as Ukraine have tended to make the assumption that the American is still the hegemon and is still all powerful. We now know that that's not true. The fundamentals of military power are two or threefold. I've written about this last year. The first is industrial capacity. And we know, for example, that Russia is outproducing the whole of the West in, for example, 155 millimeter shells. So you must have industrial capacity. The second major one is energy. Because if you can tell me how to run a tank without fuel or to drive an aircraft without fuel, then I'm open, but it won't be. So you've got to have both.
Electric vehicles.
Yeah, absolutely right, absolutely right. I mean, it's fantasy to think that we'd have electric vehicles. And if you think back to the Second World War, often people said it's a triumph of ideas. But in many ways, it was actually a triumph of those two things. The American industrial capacity and the American oil capacity was huge. And indeed, Admiral Yamamoto, who was the chief of the Japanese Navy, said anybody who has seen the oil fields of Texas and the automobile factories of Detroit knows that we can never win a war with the Americans. Okay. And I think that's the way we've got to think. But if you so what we've got now is we've got Russia as an autarkic country with good industrial production, and it's a major oil and gas exporter. So it's very, very strong. China is an importer of hydrocarbons, but is also very, very thoughtful in the way that it works. And so it has got the world's largest strategic reserves, 1.3 billion, I think. And people assume that America is an energy exporter. It's not entirely true. The United States actually imports 6.5 million barrels a day of oil. And it's because it needs to actually blend the oils with the light oils that it's got. So America's situation is not as easy on oil. And what do we also know at America's industrial capacity? We know that America's not satisfied with it because it's trying to reshore it. So I think for all those reasons, we're in a situation where we now have three great powers. And that's the way that countries need to think of it. And I think the mistake is to assume that having America on your side means you will win. And I think the most important thing is to have clear thinking on your side and diplomacy on your side and be able to cooperate with other nations rather than to assume that because you're in a state which has good relationships with America that you can say what you like to other people. I think we must be much more careful about how we talk to each other.
So you started to talk about that, but my final question is about Georgia. As a small country, shall we be concerned of emerging multipolarity? Because we are in the process of shifting to one global order to another. And the big powers are keen to sacrifice the small countries like Georgia is. Shall we be concerned about that?
I would be concerned in Georgia if you felt that there was a desire to sacrifice you. But I don't think that would make strategic sense. I think one of the issues that you have in Georgia is your geographic position, because you're between both of these large wars. I think, though, in my view, and if I were asked to advise the Georgian government, I would say the answer is to listen to people like Michael Schulenberger talking about respect, but also to think things through from first principles and to think about your national security very clearly and have good people doing that thinking. But my strong sense would be to navigate a path which is not necessarily neutral, but which seeks to not choose one or other of those big powers who are around you, but rather to navigate a path where you're working with them all. and not not making assumptions which might be weak. One of the assumptions I would be very cautious about was that assuming either the European Union or NATO will prevail. I think they're both in trouble, and it would not surprise me if one or other or both of them failed. It might not be immediately, but it could be in the medium term. And I think it's a mistake to be, for example, in an institution which is rabidly anti one of these great powers. So I'd be very cautious about that, and I would seek to choose a middle path where you maintain good relationships, or as good as is possible, with both of the entities that matter to you, or all three if you include China. And I would be very cautious about being driven, for example, by the European Union to be anti-Russia, or by Russia to be anti-European. I think I would try and choose that middle path, and you're well placed to do so. It's a thoughtful nation, and as far as I can see, a nation which is successful and on the up.
So, Commodore, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks a lot.
Pleasure. Pleasure.